All right, guys, welcome to Unit 3. We're going to be talking about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the history of the early church. We're going to be talking about the life and ministry of Jesus a little bit, but that's what we're going to be hitting in Unit 3. So this is the start of Chapter 7, the beginning of this unit. We're going to be talking about ancient Greece for the next four sections. Today we're going to talk a little bit just about ancient Greece's geography, help us get an idea of what it looked like, where they were located, and then we're just going to talk about Athens, a little bit about Sparta and the Persian Empire, some things like that. But first thing we need to do is we need to talk about their geography and their location, because that does matter. So ancient Greece is located in the Balkan Peninsula. It's the southeast part of that area. Mediterranean Sea is going to be their southern border, and then they have to the east side the Aegean Sea, the Black Sea. On the west side they have the Ionian Sea. So they have a lot of natural boundaries, which is going to be helpful for them as far as preservation of culture and being able to develop history and the arts and architecture and things like that, and help them develop as civilizations. So that's very helpful that they have all of that water surrounding them. So ancient Greece is going to be the southern portion of the Balkan Peninsula, and it does include all the little islands. Another important geographical thing to know is the Gulf of Corinth. It splits Greece into two regions. The mainland part of Greece is Attica, and then the part that's surrounded by water, almost like an island, is the Peloponnesian part. It's called Peloponnesus. And that's really going to come into play in future sections as we talk about the Spartans versus the Athenians. That's going to help you there. But first, talking about the Aegean civilization, named because it's really close to the Aegean Sea. There's three great people groups that go on during ancient Greece and the Aegean civilization that you need to know, and they are the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the Trojans. The Minoans are going to be located on the island of Crete. The Mycenaeans are located in the Greek mainland, and then the Trojans occupy Troy, obviously. So we're going to discuss them in this order, so if you want to write these down for your notes, that way you have the spelling, and we'll come back to all three of these. But first, we're going to talk about the Minoans. So they were the first important European civilization after the flood. Around 1900, Sir Arthur Evans, who was a British archaeologist, he uncovered a palace of King Minos in Knossos, and so that's really when we were able to first discover and learn about them. We know from what we can tell that they were really advanced, and this was before Abraham's time. So that's interesting. You know me, any civilization that has indoor plumbing, I'm always fascinated with, especially if they were able to run a lot of these things without electricity. Always fascinated. So the Minoans, they had great plumbing. They had clay vases, and they used them for stuff too, not just for writing history on it. They had bronze daggers, so they learned how to work with bronze. They had cups of gold, so they learned how to work with gold. They were really good at working with metals, apparently. They used ivory for carvings, and they also had something very cool in the context of art, is they had wall paintings that were called frescoes. And so here's just a couple of pictures of that. This is a very famous one, dealing with a bull. So that's fun. And then dolphins. How pretty. So with the Minoans, we do know that they traded with Egypt and Mesopotamia and learned from their cultures, which we talked about that. That's cultural diffusion. Usually happens through trade, and just from what we have gathered and learned and studied, we know that they did trade with those two groups. The Minoans' civilization is going to end around 1400 BC just because of a series of natural disasters. And then after those natural disasters, they're attacked by the mainland part of Greece. So that's sad. There's still a lot that is unknown about the Minoans because their ancient handwriting has not been deciphered. So it's still hard to know a whole lot about their history, which is why We don't really talk about leaders or things like that, just because we're not really sure. So that was the first group, the Minoans. The next group is the Mycenaeans. And here's a map just to give you an idea of just how big their territory went. It was mainland Greece, it was Peloponnesus, it was a lot of the islands. You can see down towards the bottom of the screen we have Knossos that we referred to with the Minoans and the island of Crete. So this civilization is named after the city Mycenae, which you can see in the Peloponnesus part. So that's where they were located. These are the Greeks that are referred to when we talk about the Trojan War. And so just to give you an idea, just some cool stuff about their city. That's some really cool architecture. But yes, these are the Greeks that we refer to when we talk about the Trojan War, that are referenced in Homer's epics that he writes about with the Iliad and Odyssey. This civilization starts up around 1900 BC. We see them adopt a lot of aspects of the Minoan culture. They do start to get invaded by a group called the Dorians, and they start to really be oppressed. So many Mycenaeans will escape and leave to Asia Minor and Attica. And this group, they become known as the Ionians. And that matters because we're going to refer to them later with the Ionian Revolt, and so it's good to know that those Ionians are Mycenaeans that evacuated and escaped and went to Asia Minor. Now, not all Mycenaeans left. Some stayed, and they combined with the Dorians, and so those are going to be a lot of our Hellenistic influence. And so this group of people, they made a lot of contributions to Western civilization, and this is really where we get a lot of our Greek inspiration for fraternities and sororities in colleges. It came from this area. So let's talk about the Trojan War. So we talked about the Minoans, the Mycenaeans. Now let's talk about the Trojans. The Trojans are going to be fighting the Mycenaeans. It's around 1200 BC. The Mycenaeans are going to be trying to invade Troy, conquer Troy, for about 10 years, trying to get in there. And legends say the only reason why the Trojan War ended was because the Mycenaeans pretended to leave and left behind the famous Trojan horse, a wooden horse that had soldiers hiding inside. And a lot of these pictures that I'm using are from the movie Troy with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana, Orlando Bloom. And so it is rated R, so if you are going to watch it because you're interested, I do advise that you have a filter of some sort, just because, war movies, it's going to have what you would expect. So I do want to give that disclaimer that I do advise you watch it with some type of filter, just because we want to keep things age appropriate. But anyways, legends say that the Trojan War ended because the Mycenaeans pretended to leave, but they had soldiers hiding inside, and they left behind this wooden horse as like a sacrifice to the gods so that they would have safe voyage home. And the Trojans got cocky and celebrated and wheeled in this wooden horse that they didn't realize had soldiers hidden inside. And then they partied hard all night long. And then eventually everybody passed out drunk. And then the Mycenaean soldiers, the Greeks, came out of the horse, and they were able to just finally get inside Troy so they could make it crumble from within, because for 10 years they had been trying to infiltrate Troy but could never get inside the city. And so finally the Trojans just brought them into the city. That's what legends say. And so this is actually a monument that you can visit in Greece, paying homage to the Trojan horse, I guess. Legends also say that this war was started over the fight because of a woman. And so this is Helen of Troy. This is the same lady that plays in National Treasure. She's actually a model, but she does movies too. Scholars for a while believe that Troy never even existed until 1870s, whenever an amateur archaeologist, who was really just a wealthy German businessman, he unearthed 9 cities, proving that Troy did exist. But the rumor was that the war might have started because of Trojan interference with Mycenaean commerce, or because the Prince of Troy fell in love with one of the Mycenaean prince's wives. So Helen of Troy used to not be Helen of Troy. She used to be Helen of Greece, and ran away with the guy that plays Orlando Bloom to Troy. And so that just starts a huge war, and this prince goes to his brother, who's the king, and the king's like, awesome, finally, I wanted an excuse to invade Troy. Now I got one. This is a matter of honor. And again, this is all, the movie's storyline. So they go back to Troy, this couple, and Big Brother, who is, in line to be king, has to fight to protect the city of Troy, and then the Mycenaeans bring their champion, who is Achilles, played by Brad Pitt. And so that's the whole story. I'm not going to tell you everything else that happens. If you're curious, you can watch. So the theories are, one, either the Trojan War started because of a woman and her leaving her husband to go to Troy, and they were upset about that, or the Trojans were interfering with Mycenaean commerce and wouldn't butt out. One or the other, who knows? So yeah. Okay, but this does bring me to Homer, not Homer Simpson, but the Bard. Homer is very interesting because this poet has more influence on a group of people than any other poet in history. He probably lived around the 700s BC. He was a bard, and also some people thought that he was blind. We can't confirm that as far as your textbook goes, but they do think it is possible. So he wrote 2 epics. Remember, epics are heroic tales. Oftentimes the hero dies, blah, blah, blah. So he wrote 2 important epics, and they focused on the Trojan War. They were the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad talks about the heroic deeds of the Greeks in their war against Troy, and then Odyssey is about a Greek warrior, Odysseus, going on a journey home after defeating Troy, and this journey takes 10 years long. My goodness, we sit in a car for 5 hours and say, are we there yet? Are we there yet? This guy had a 10-year journey home. So that's a long trip. But that's not the only thing that Homer gave us, were those 2 books, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He also gave us a religion. So let's talk about the Olympian gods. Supposedly they lived on Mount Olympus. That's why they're called the Olympian gods. And this whole concept was introduced by Homer. Homer basically made these guys up. They're very similar to the gods of Mesopotamia and Egypt and some other cultures. A lot of these gods were associated with powers of nature. So we have Zeus. Zeus is the chief god. He is also the father of a lot of other gods and goddesses. He is associated with thunder and lightning. That's a good thing to know. All of that stuff about Zeus. He has 2 brothers, Poseidon, who is the god of the sea. And if you need to know spelling, you can follow along in your book, and they'll help you spell a lot of this stuff. So I'm not going to spell out all this stuff for you guys, just to save time. So we have Zeus, his brother Poseidon, who's the god of the sea, and then they have a 3rd brother, Hades, the god of the dead and the underworld. Zeus has a son named Apollo, who is, ironically, god of the sun. And he's Zeus' son, so that's interesting. And then he also has a daughter, Artemis, who's goddess of the moon. We see Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Ares, god of war. Oh, Athena is the goddess of wisdom and strategy. So if you ever were to write a story about Athena and Ares, it kind of goes together. And then we have Hera, who is the goddess of marriage. She was actually Zeus's wife. And so that's fun. Just, there's so many Greek gods and goddesses out there. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of them because this is a history class, not a Greek mythology class. But it is quite entertaining to see how they all interact and how they have such human personalities. And that is where Olympian gods differ from other religions, is because, one, they were created by a poet. They were figments of his imagination, and these gods had individual human personalities. All of these other religions that we've talked about so far were very impersonal gods. They didn't really interact with humans, and it's just very different. Another thing that Homer introduces with the Olympian gods is the concept of heroes. They only differed from gods by the fact that they were mortal and less powerful. But they always had unusual abilities and loads and loads and loads of bravery. An example of that would be in the Iliad. His hero is Achilles. Achilles, was immortal. He could die. He was less powerful than the gods, but he had loads of bravery and he was a very skilled fighter. The only reason why he died is because a poisoned arrow pierced his heel, which happened to be his one weak spot. Like, seriously, of all places, can you imagine your one weak spot is your elbow? Okay, no, I actually believe that your elbow could be more of a weak spot than your Achilles heel, because hitting your funny bone is so painful. So that's just me, but that is why we call it the Achilles tendon. It's because of Achilles. That's where he got pierced by the poison arrow, and that's how he died. So so we talked about the Olympian gods and heroes. We also had demigods, which is where one of their parents was a god and then the other was a mortal. An example of this would be someone like Hercules. Zeus was his father. Contrary to the cartoon, Hera was not his mom. His mom was a human. Hera, so Hades could care less about Hercules. Hera was the one that was jealous. And so definitely see some artistic liberties and rewrites there just to make that movie a success. But anyways, that's not the point of this. So we talked about the gods, the goddesses, demigods, heroes. With all of this stuff for their religion, we get a sense of it's a really depressing religion, because after you die, there's no hope. There's no help. You're going one place. It is what it is. Greeks weren't concerned about life after death because they knew what was going to happen. They're going to see Hades in the land of shadows. That's how it was. With the Egyptians, we saw so many of them were focused on the afterlife that they were building these massive pyramids and putting all these treasures in there, and boats and canoes and chariots, all this stuff, and guard dogs and riches for their life and the afterlife. But the Greeks were like, no, we're gonna end up with Hades in the underworld, so we're just not gonna worry about it. Now, heroes and a few other do-gooders would go to a different place called Elysian Fields, which means land of bliss. But other than that, you went to the underworld, and this is, again, from the cartoon movie Hercules, where you see Hades in the underworld, and there's the lake that's basically just a bunch of dead ghosts. And anyways, so because of this life after death, a lot of Greeks believed that the best life lived was one devoted to the best interests of your city-state, leaving it better than you found it. But because there was no goal of any type of life after death, they failed to provide a standard of morality and any incentive for just living. And this will lead to the fall of Greece. So now that we talked about the religion, let's talk about the city-states. Before Homer came along and introduced the Olympian gods, they worshipped their ancestors. Now, when you worship ancestors, that creates very strong family ties. Strong family ties become tribes and villages, and those tribes and villages evolve into cities. And so that's the progression that we see in ancient Greece. Cities are going to take on a new name, and it's polis, P-O-L-I-S. And this is where we get the word politics, metropolis, all of that other stuff. Yes, I just referenced superheroes. Metropolis. Okay, so a typical polis will surround an acropolis. An acropolis is a fortress that sits on a hilltop. And the reason why it sits on a hilltop is because this is kind of like where everyone goes when your city is under attack. Everybody goes to this refuge, this fortress. And so that's why it's usually seated on a hilltop. And this is where the heads of government would be residing. Also, this is where any religious worship would take place as well. Any temples would be in the acropolis. You also see the agora, or a marketplace. Marketplace, this wasn't just where you shopped and traded. This is also where you hung out. This is where you had conversations. This is where you saw lively debates. It happened in the agora. We also see gymnasiums brought to you by ancient Greece. Gymnasiums were places of physical training, also where you could practice games of skill. And then we also see amphitheaters. Amphitheaters are just outdoor theaters, and so this is what one of those looks like. You can see the stage is actually lower instead of higher, and then instead of having the stage be propped up, the seating is in a raised motion, so that way everybody could see what's happening down below. Each polis ended up forming its own city-state, and so in Greece, we ended up having about 150 city-states. So, but that brings me to my next point. Yes, there were a lot of city-states, and they were all Greek. They all spoke the same language. They all had the common religion, but there was no political unity. They did not see themselves as an entire people group. But they did agree that barbarians, which were people who did not speak Greek, were inferior to people who did speak Greek. So they were all snobby in the sense that if you couldn't speak Greek, you were less human, or just not as developed and evolved and intelligent. Another way that they did show some form of unity was the Olympic Games, which we know now with the 5 rings. We know the Olympics now to be a little different. But even back then, in the beginning, it started around 776 BC. That was the first year that they had the Olympic Games, and it was held every 4 years. Cool thing about this, because it was just Greece, it was always hosted in Olympia because it was meant to honor Zeus. And so that's why they wanted to be close to Mount Olympus. So they held it in Olympia every 4 years. Every time they had an Olympic, they would call a truce between any warring city-states just during the time of the games. So the games went on until about AD 394. It was stopped by Emperor Theodosius, or he's going to shut it down, and then we won't see the Olympic Games again until 1896. And when it does resurface, it will become an international event. Everybody gets to participate worldwide. And so I always thought, wouldn't that be interesting if back in the day they called a truce between all warring city-states, if during the Olympic Games now, if they called a truce of every battle, every area of tension throughout the world, if they all called a truce just during the Olympics, I think that would be nuts. That'd be crazy. We wouldn't know what to do with ourselves. So that's the Olympics, just giving us an idea of what they were like, what the Greeks were like as a group of people. And now I want to talk about the Greco-Persian Wars. So after we finish talking about this, we'll be done with this section. So there's not too much left. I think I have maybe 4 or 5 more slides. So you guys are doing great. Hang in there with me. The Greco-Persian Wars only last for about 11 years. So it's not too long. It is if you compare it to how we think of wars now, but for that, that wasn't too bad. And the Greco-Persian War all starts with the Ionian Revolt. So Cyrus the Great, who is the leader of Persia, the Persian Empire at this time, he conquers Ionia, which was the Greek part of Asia Minor. Okay, I'm going to take a pause real quick. Anytime I say Asia Minor, I want you to think of modern day Turkey. Okay, think of Turkey whenever I say Asia Minor, just to help geographically get an idea of where that is located. Because while the Ionians are European because they're Greek, Turkey is in Asia. It's in the Middle East. So that's a good thing to remember. So Cyrus the Great, he conquers Ionia, And so the Ionians are going to revolt in 499 BC, and Darius, Cyrus's son, he's going to crush that revolution, and he's going to not just settle for Ionia, he's going to also want the mainland Greeks to submit to him as well. And Athens and Sparta and Eretria, they're all like, no thanks, we don't want to join the Persian Empire. Really kind of you to offer, but no. And that's just not going to fly. So we get the Battle of Marathon. It's spelled just like it sounds, marathon, like you're running. So Darius, he is going to send a fleet of 600 ships with 25,000 men. Just a little bit of an overkill. So he sends them out to defeat Eretria around 490 BC, and he does defeat Eretria, and he starts to approach the city of Marathon. And the city of Marathon is about a day's march away from Athens. So Athens are definitely motivated to get this battle handled in Marathon, because they don't want the Persians to actually make it to Athens, and then they have to see their home become a battlefield. So Athens is fighting so intensely that Persia is forced all the way back to their ships, even though the Persians outnumbered the Athenians without the Spartans' presence. And then they're going to give the Persians a second defeat, this time at Athens. And after that, the Persians go home after losing 6,000 men. 6,000 men. They came with 25,000 and they lost 6,000. That's almost a fourth of your army. And so this was a big signal, a big wake-up call for ancient Greece, because they realized the Persian Empire, the strongest empire in the world at this time, they could be defeated. It was possible. Athens did it. And that was without the Spartans, who were the trained military class in Greece. And the Athenians did it without the Spartans. So Athens is going to start to rise in power among the other cities in Greece because of this awesome victory. They're totally going to be like, yeah, that was us. So they definitely get a name for themselves there. And then we get to another battle. So we talked about the Battle of Marathon. Next battle is the Battle of Thermopylae. And I know that one's a hard one to spell, so notice that the spelling is at the top of the slide. This was around 480 BC. This is 10 years after the Battle of Marathon. Talk about holding a grudge. So 10 years after Marathon, Xerxes is going to come, and he was determined to conquer the Greeks and mainland Greece. He assembled such a large army, only a portion of them were able to travel by ship. The rest of them had to march on land. And Sparta is going to make an alliance of 30 cities. And we're going to see this showdown in 480 BC in the city of Thermopylae. The reason why they did it, I'm going to go back real quick, is because if you can see on this map, they're in the area of Thermopylae, and there's a very small pass. And so the reason why the Spartans wanted to fight here is because it was a narrow mountain pass. You have water on one side, mountain on the other, and so it forced the Persians to kind of bottleneck, and so that's going to make it easier for them to continue to keep picking them off as they got closer. So we see Xerxes versus Leonidas, who is the Spartan general, leader, king, whatever you want to call him. And he did this with only 300 soldiers. And what makes this story so heroic and amazing is because they already knew they weren't going to survive this. The Spartans that stayed behind, Leonidas and his 300 soldiers, they laid down their lives to delay the Persians so that all of the other Greeks that were there could escape, because they knew that they weren't going to win. And so that's what made it very heroic, is that they stayed there, laid down their lives, and held off the Persians as long as they could so everybody else could escape. And because of that, the rest of the Greeks are going to be able to regroup and fight another day. And then we get the Battle of Salamis. Salamis. So Athens will evacuate to the city of Salamis, And Xerxes is going to come through and just burn temples and other public buildings all over the Acropolis and just tear it to pieces. And this one guy, Themistocles, is going to trick Xerxes. He's basically going to take advantage of Xerxes' pride. And he's going to trick Xerxes into fighting a naval battle. And while Persia does have a much better navy, the problem is their boats were not equipped to handle this area. And so the Athenians, with all of these choppy waters and rocks everywhere, the Athenians can outmaneuver Xerxes' ships because the Persian ships are so long and very awkward to steer. It was so rough for Xerxes, his ships started sinking each other. And so the Battle of Salamis is a big deal because of many reasons, but a big reason is this was the first serious major naval battle in history. Xerxes loses a third of his fleet. 1/3 of his fleet gets destroyed in this. And that's a big deal because, first off, Battle of Salamis, first major naval battle in history. Second, this was a big defeat for the Persian Empire. A small remnant of the survivors of the Persian army are going to stay in Greece until we get to the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, but most of them will retreat to Persia. And the Battle of Plataea, that is the end of the Greco-Persian War. So, last slide right here. Let's talk about Greece's victory. Xerxes, his defeat in Greece was a big turning point in world history because remember, the Persian Empire during this time was the strongest empire in the known world. On this map, the Persian Empire is everything in orange. Okay, so it goes Egypt all the way to Hindu Kush. It's so vast. And what made this so impressive is by the Greeks winning the Greco-Persian War, they put an absolute limit on the western border of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire will never go past where it is on this map. They never invade Greece. They never make it through the rest of the Balkans. And so that's a big deal because that sent a message to the rest of the world also, not just to the rest of Greece, but to the whole world that the Persians can be stopped, they can be defeated. And also we see Greeks start to emerge with a new pride of being Greek. This is where we start to actually see Greeks unite and have a little bit more political unity. This unity will be short-lived because we will have Sparta and Athens eventually turn against each other, and then we'll get the Peloponnesian War, which we'll talk about in another section. But yay for the Greeks because they did beat the Persian Empire and they were able to preserve their territory, and so that is awesome.